Lady Eleanor Vance had decided, with the quiet finality of a book being closed for the last time, that she was finished with hope. At 35 years of age, hope was a currency she could no longer afford. It was a youthful extravagance, a luxury for girls with glittering dowries and futures that stretched out like sunlit carpets. Hers was a narrow, shadowed path, worn smooth by the soles of resignation. Tonight, at the Duchess of Pemberton's annual ball, that path had led her to a familiar alcove, partially hidden by a monstrous fern. From here, she could observe the glittering pageant of the Tun without being a part of it. She was a spectator at the festival of her own life, watching from a distant hill as others danced in the valley below. Her gown, a deep sapphire silk, was a testament to her mother's strained finances and desperate optimism. It was 3 seasons out of date, its simple lines a stark contrast to the frothy confections of lace and ribbon worn by the debutantes. They were like a flock of vibrant, chattering birds, while Eleanor felt more like a quiet, grey dove, camouflaged against the stone of the ballroom walls. She held a glass of lukewarm lemonade, the condensation beading on her gloved fingers. The music of the waltz swelled and receded, a tide of sound that washed over her without purchase. She had once loved to dance. She remembered a time when her feet had felt light, when a gentleman's hand at her waist promised not a transaction, but a fleeting, dizzying joy. That girl was a ghost now, a faint memory from a decade past. Her mother had insisted she attend. "You never know, Eleanor," she had whispered, her voice tight with a familiar, anxious energy, while fussing with a stray lock of Eleanor's hair. "Someone might see you. Someone might remember the lovely girl you were." But they did not see a lovely girl. They saw a spinster. The word itself was a brand, a mark of failure, in a world where a woman's worth was measured by the quality of her match. She had had chances, of course. A portly baron with a wet cough and wandering hands. A young vicar with more piety than personality. She had refused them, clinging to a foolish, romantic notion that she was deserving of more. Now, there were no more offers, only the pitying glances and the careful, polite way conversations died when she approached. A burst of laughter from a nearby group drew her attention. Lady Beatrice Croft, this season's incomparable, was holding court. She was all of 18, with hair the colour of spun gold and a smile that was both dazzling and cruel. Eleanor had seen that smile directed at less fortunate girls, a weapon sharper than any blade. "Can you imagine?" Lady Beatrice trilled, her voice carrying across the music. "To still be attending balls at her age. It is rather pathetic, is it not? Like a wilting flower refusing to be swept from the vase." The words, though not directed at her by name, found their mark. A familiar chill, cold and sharp, slid beneath Eleanor's skin. She did not need to look to know they spoke of her. Her fingers tightened around her glass, the delicate crystal threatening to splinter. She should have stayed home. She should have pleaded a headache and lost herself in her books, in the quiet company of characters who did not judge. She took a slow, steadying breath, forcing her shoulders to relax. It was only words. She had endured worse. She had endured the slow erosion of her family's fortune, the worried lines deepening on her mother's face, the quiet selling of heirlooms to make ends meet. The careless cruelty of a teenage girl was a minor sting in comparison. Just as she resolved to slip away unnoticed, a sudden hush fell over the far end of the ballroom. It was not a silence, but a shift in the very atmosphere of the room. A collective intake of breath. The music faltered for a half beat, Conversations dwindled to whispers. Eleanor leaned forward slightly, peering around the fern. The crowd near the grand entrance was parting, creating a wide, reverent path. Through it walked a man who seemed to draw all the light and shadow in the room toward himself. The Duke of Alistair. He was a figure of legend and fear. Julian Croft, the Iron Duke. A man who had inherited a title on the brink of ruin and, through sheer ruthlessness and financial genius, had forged it into one of the most powerful and solvent dukedoms in England. He was spoken of in hushed, awed tones in the gentlemen's clubs and in fearful whispers in the drawing rooms. He was ferociously private, brutally efficient, and utterly unreadable. His face, stark and handsome, was a mask of cold control. He never attended events like this. His presence was so rare as to be a phenomenon, and the entire room seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what had brought the lion into the sheep's pen. Eleanor felt a strange, unwelcome flutter in her chest. She had seen him once before, years ago, at a distance. He had been younger then, but the same intimidating aura had clung to him. Now, it was amplified by a decade of success and solitude. His dark hair was untouched by silver, and his eyes, the color of a winter sky, swept over the room with an unnerving lack of interest. They dismissed the hopeful debutantes, the scheming mothers, the powerful lords. His gaze continued its sweep, methodical and deliberate. And then it stopped. It stopped on her. For a paralyzing moment, Eleanor was certain she was mistaken. He was surely looking at the decorative urn behind her, or the tapestry on the wall. But his eyes did not move. They were fixed on her alcove, on her, with an intensity that felt like a physical touch. The noise of the ballroom faded to a distant hum. It was just the two of them, separated by a sea of silks and jewels. Then he began to move. He did not stroll. He did not meander. He walked with a singular purpose, his path cleaving through the stunned assembly directly toward her. Whispers followed in his wake like the rustling of dry leaves. Eleanor's heart began to hammer against her ribs, a frantic, trapped thing. Her mind raced. Had she done something to offend him? Was he related to the Duchess and coming to ask why she was hiding behind the foliage? Her hand holding the lemonade glass began to tremble. He stopped directly in front of her alcove. He was taller than she had imagined, a formidable presence that blocked out the light and the rest of the world. He looked down at her, his expression as impenetrable as ever. The scent of cold night air and expensive wool clung to him. "Lady Eleanor Vance," he said. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the silence with absolute clarity. It was a low, resonant baritone, devoid of any warmth. It was a statement, not a question. She could only manage a faint, breathless nod. Her throat felt as if it were packed with dust. The Duke of Alistair gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod of his own. He did not offer a pleasantry. He did not inquire as to her health or the quality of the evening. He looked at her with those chilling grey eyes and delivered a statement that shattered the foundations of her world. "You will marry me," he said. The words fell like stones into a frozen pond. The silence that followed was absolute, a ringing void where the whispers had been. Eleanor stared at him, convinced she had misheard, that this was some bizarre waking dream brought on by bad lemonade and social anxiety. Lady Beatrice's gasp was the first sound to break the spell. It was a sharp, scandalized noise. All eyes were on them. Eleanor felt the heat of 1,000 stares, a suffocating pressure. The Duke seemed oblivious to the audience. His focus remained entirely on her. It was not a proposal. There was no question in his tone, no bended knee, no ring. It was a command, a declaration of fact. I beg your pardon, Eleanor finally managed to whisper, her voice a fragile thread. There is no need to beg for anything, madam, he replied, his tone unchanged. I believe my statement was clear. I have secured a special license. The wedding will be on Tuesday. He then did something even more shocking. He reached out, his gloved hand taking hers. His touch was firm, cool, and utterly possessive. He lifted her trembling fingers to his lips, his gaze never leaving hers. The gesture, which should have been romantic, felt like the sealing of a contract, a brand. Without another word, he turned on his heel and strode from the ballroom as purposefully as he had entered, leaving Eleanor standing in the wreckage of her quiet, predictable life. The ghost of his touch on her hand, and the echo of his impossible command ringing in her ears. The days that followed were a blur of chaos and confusion. The Duke's pronouncement had exploded in London society like a cannonball, and Eleanor was at the epicenter of the blast. Her mother oscillated between hysterical joy at the match and sheer terror of the man himself. "The Duke of Alistair," she would repeat, fanning herself dramatically. "Eleanor, do you comprehend? You will be a duchess, the Iron Duchess." Then her expression would crumple. "But he is so cold. They say he has no heart." Eleanor had no answers. The Duke had not called on her. He had sent his solicitor, a dry, precise man who laid out the marriage settlements with the emotional detachment of someone discussing crop yields. The terms were beyond generous. They were staggering. Eleanor's family debts would be erased. Her mother would be granted a handsome annuity for life. A fortune would be settled on Eleanor herself, untouchable and entirely her own. It was a business transaction. She was being purchased. For what reason, she could not fathom. She was not a beauty. She had no connections of value to a man like Alistair. She brought nothing to the table but a tarnished name and a reputation for being on the shelf. The incongruity of it all was a constant, nagging puzzle in her mind. On Tuesday, as decreed, she was married. The ceremony took place in the Duke's London residence, a vast, imposing mansion that felt more like a mausoleum than a home. It was a cold, brief affair, witnessed only by her weeping mother and the Duke's grim-faced solicitor. The Duke himself was a statue of composure. He spoke his vows in that same flat, resonant voice, his hand cool and steady as he placed a heavy gold band on her finger. When the vicar instructed him to kiss the bride, he hesitated for a fraction of a second. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. He leaned in, his lips brushing her cheek with a touch as brief and cold as a snowflake. It was over before it began. She was now the Duchess of Alistair. The title felt like a costume she was wearing, ill-fitting and strange. After the ceremony, he escorted her to a small, formal drawing room. "This is your home now," he said, gesturing vaguely at the opulent but lifeless room. "You will have the run of the house. The east wing contains the Duchess's suites. They are at your disposal. I reside in the west wing. We will take dinner together each evening at 8. His words were a map, drawing the boundaries of their shared existence. East wing, west wing. A house divided. A marriage in name only. Why? The question escaped her before she could stop it. It was the only question that mattered. He turned to look at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of something in his grey eyes. something other than cold indifference. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "I required a wife," he stated simply. "You were suitable." And with that, he left her alone in the silent, cavernous room, the word "suitable" echoing in the space between them. It was an explanation that explained nothing at all. Life in the ducal mansion was a study in quiet solitude. The staff were impeccably trained, moving through the grand rooms like ghosts, their deference a constant reminder of her new, bewildering status. She spent her days in the vast library, a magnificent room that was the only place in the house that seemed to have any life. The scent of old paper and leather was a comfort, a balm to her frayed nerves. Dinners were tense, silent affairs. They sat at opposite ends of a dining table so long it felt like they were in different rooms. The Duke, her husband, ate with a focused precision, his attention on his plate. He would ask her perfunctory questions about her day, and she would give him polite, brief answers. They were two strangers, performing a play for an audience of silent footmen. Yet, Eleanor was an observer by nature, and she began to notice things. Small, insignificant details that seemed to contradict the image of the cold, ruthless Iron Duke. One afternoon, a package arrived for her. It was a large, flat box wrapped in plain brown paper. Inside, nestled in tissue, was a first edition of The Natural History of Selborne by Gilbert White, a book she had once mentioned in passing, years ago, to a friend at a garden party. She had spoken of how she wished she could see the original illustrations. This copy had them, exquisitely rendered. There was no note. When she cautiously thanked him for it at dinner, he merely inclined his head. "I was aware of your interest in the subject," was all he said. Another time, she was walking in the gardens, a sprawling, manicured expanse that felt as formal and cold as the house. She stumbled upon a small, locked gate, almost hidden by overgrown ivy. Her curiosity piqued, she asked the head gardener about it later. He informed her that it was the Duke's private conservatory, and no one was permitted inside. Then there was the incident with her mother. Her mother came to call, her anxiety barely concealed beneath a veneer of maternal concern. "Eleanor, you look pale. Is he treating you well? You must make an effort, dear. A man like that requires a certain effort." They were in the main drawing room when the Duke entered unexpectedly. He had stopped, silent in the doorway, and Eleanor knew he had overheard her mother's fretful words. A cold dread washed over her. She expected a sharp retort, a chilling dismissal. Instead, he walked calmly into the room. "Lady Vance," he said, his voice level. "Eleanor is the Duchess of Alistair. She is not required to make an effort. Her presence in this house is effort enough. I trust you will not burden her with such anxieties again." Her mother had paled, stammering an apology before making a hasty retreat. The Duke had simply turned to Eleanor, his face impassive. "Your mother means well," he said, a statement of fact, not of comfort. But it was a defense, a quiet, unyielding shield placed around her. These moments were cracks in his armor of indifference. They were tiny fissures that let out a confusing light. They did not speak of affection, but of attention. A deep, specific, and unsettlingly long-term attention. He knew she liked botany. He had defended her from her own mother. He was a man of contradictions, and the puzzle of him was beginning to consume her thoughts. The ton, of course, was abuzz with speculation. They had been married for a month, and the rumors were relentless. The most persistent one was championed by the still incensed Lady Beatrice Croft, who happened to be the Duke's distant cousin. She spread the story that Alistair had only married the aging spinster to acquire a small, forgotten parcel of land that adjoined his northern estate. Land that was still, technically, part of the Vance family's entailed property. The rumor was plausible enough to take root. It painted the Duke as the ruthless strategist everyone believed him to be, and Eleanor as a mere pawn in a game of land acquisition. It made a cold, logical sense that their marriage otherwise lacked. The whispers reached Eleanor, as they were intended to. Her maid, a kind, loyal girl named Anna, relayed them with a reluctant expression. The words stung more than Eleanor wanted to admit, not because she believed them. She was not sure what to believe, but because they reinforced her own feelings of worthlessness. A pawn, a piece of property traded for another. The breaking point came at the Rawlingham's musicale. It was their first major social event as a married couple, and Eleanor felt a familiar dread as they entered the crowded ballroom. All eyes were on them. The Iron Duke and his inexplicable spinster bride. She stood by his side, her hand resting stiffly on his arm. He was a formidable shield, his very presence silencing the most audacious whispers. But she could still feel the weight of their curiosity. Lady Beatrice, emboldened by a coterie of her admirers, approached them. Her smile was pure venom wrapped in sweetness. "Your Grace," she cooed, curtsying to the Duke. She then turned her gaze to Eleanor, her eyes sweeping over her with blatant disdain. "And, Duchess, how lovely to see you out. I do hope you are enjoying your new station, and I trust my cousin finds his new acreage to be worth the price." The insult was direct, public, and utterly vicious. The air grew thick with tension. A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. Eleanor froze, the blood draining from her face. She felt small and exposed, the same helpless girl hiding behind the fern. Before she could even form a response, the Duke moved. It was a subtle shift, but it changed the entire dynamic of the room. He turned his body slightly, positioning himself more fully in front of Eleanor, a solid wall of black wool. He looked down at his young cousin, and for the first time, Eleanor saw something other than coldness in his eyes. It was a glacial fury, so profound it seemed to lower the temperature of the air around them. "Beatrice," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "You will apologize to my wife." Lady Beatrice's smirk faltered. "Julian, I was only jesting." "You were not," he cut in, the softness vanishing, replaced by steel. "You were insolent. You have insulted the Duchess of Alistair. You have insulted me. You will apologize to her now, or you will find that the Croft family's credit, which I have been generously extending for the last 5 years, will be revoked at dawn. Your father will be ruined before luncheon." The threat was delivered without a hint of emotion, which made it all the more terrifying. It was a simple statement of cause and effect. Lady Beatrice's face went ashen. The reality of his power, the power she had so carelessly provoked, crashed down on her. Her eyes, now wide with panic, darted to Eleanor. She mumbled a hasty, humiliated apology before practically fleeing into the crowd. The Duke did not watch her go. He turned his attention back to Eleanor. His expression had softened, the fury receding back beneath the impassive surface. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low. She could only nod, her throat too tight to speak. He had not just defended her, he had annihilated her tormentor. He had used the full, terrifying weight of his power to protect her honor. For a parcel of land? It made no sense. The sheer disproportionality of his reaction was staggering. "I wish to go home," she whispered. "Of course," he said immediately. He placed his hand over hers on his arm, his grip firm and steadying. He led her from the ballroom, the crowd parting before them like the Red Sea. The carriage ride back to the mansion was silent, but it was a different kind of silence. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the thunder of unspoken questions. Eleanor sat across from him, studying his profile in the flickering lamplight. The mask was back in place, but she had seen what was behind it. She had seen the dragon that guarded her. When they arrived, he walked her to the base of the grand staircase that led to her wing. He stopped, and she turned to face him. "Tonight," she began, her voice gaining strength. "What you did." "She insulted you," he stated, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. "She insulted the Duchess of Alistair," Eleanor corrected gently. "A title, a position." "No," he said, and his gaze was so direct it stole her breath. "She insulted you, Eleanor." It was the first time he had used her given name without a title attached. It sounded strange and intimate in the echoing silence of the hall. The dam of her confusion finally broke. She had to know. The uncertainty was a torment worse than any polite neglect. "Why?" she asked, her voice pleading. "Why did you marry me? It was not for land. I do not believe that. What you did tonight was not the act of a man protecting an investment. So tell me the truth. I deserve that much." He looked at her for a long, unblinking moment. The silence stretched, heavy and profound. She saw a battle being waged behind his eyes, a conflict that tightened the muscles in his jaw. She thought he would turn away, retreat back to the fortress of his west wing. Instead, he gave a slow, weary sigh. It was the most vulnerable sound she had ever heard him make. "You are right," he said, his voice rough. "You deserve the truth. Come with me." He turned and led her not toward the west wing, but toward the back of the house, to the part of the gardens she had never explored. He produced a key from his waistcoat and unlocked the small, ivy-covered gate. He pushed it open, revealing a path that led to a large glass structure, the conservatory. He led her inside. The air was warm and humid, thick with the scent of damp earth and blooming flowers. It was a riot of life and colour, a stark contrast to the sterile perfection of the rest of the estate. There were orchids and ferns, flowering vines climbing the glass walls, and in the centre, a stunning collection of camellias, their waxy petals in shades of white, pink, and deep red. "You loved camellias," he said, his back to her as he looked at the flowers. "You wore a white one in your hair at the Ashworth summer party, 10 years ago." Eleanor's mind spun. The Ashworth's party. She had been 25, just past the bloom of her first few seasons, but still hopeful. She remembered that night. She remembered the flower. How could he possibly know that? "I was there," he continued, as if hearing her thoughts. "I was not yet the Duke. I was just Julian Croft, my father's reckless and arrogant heir. I watched you from across the lawn. You were talking about poetry with old Lord Ellington. You were so animated, so brilliant. You shone." He turned to face her, and the mask was gone. In its place was a raw, aching vulnerability that stunned her into silence. The Iron Duke was gone. This was a man. haunted and weary. "I wanted to speak to you," he said, his voice low and strained. "I was determined to, but I was called away. My father had made an investment, a catastrophic one, based on advice I had given him. He thought it would double our fortune. Instead, it ruined us. And it ruined several other families who had invested alongside him." He paused, and his gaze dropped to the floor. The shame radiating from him was a palpable force. "One of those families," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "was the Vances. Your father lost almost everything because of my arrogance, my greed. By the time the dust settled, my father was dead from the shock of it. I had inherited a title drowning in debt, and your future was destroyed. The dowry you should have had, the life you deserved, it was gone. And it was my fault." Eleanor sank onto a small iron bench, her legs suddenly unable to support her. The pieces of the puzzle of her life, pieces she never knew were connected, began to slam into place. Her father's sudden financial ruin, his bitterness in the years before his death, her mother's desperation, her own slow descent into spinsterhood. It all traced back to him, to a decision made 10 years ago. "I loved you from that night, Eleanor," he confessed, the words raw and painful. "But how could I approach you? I was the man who had ruined you. I was poison. So I made a vow. I would spend every waking moment rebuilding what I had broken. I worked. I clawed my way back. I restored the Alistair fortune. And then I started on the others." He looked at her, his eyes pleading for understanding. "Through anonymous channels, I propped up your family's finances as best I could without raising suspicion. I made sure you never fell into true poverty. It was my penance. And I watched you from afar. I saw you refuse the Baron, the vicar. I saw your spirit, your intelligence, being ground down by a society that couldn't see your worth. And every pitying glance you received was a knife in my gut. I waited," he said, his voice thick with a decade of unshed emotion. "I told myself I would wait until I was powerful enough to give you everything, to protect you from everyone. I thought maybe then I would have atoned enough to deserve to even be in the same room as you. But I was a coward. I was afraid that if you knew the truth, you would hate me, and I could not bear your hatred." He finally looked up, meeting her eyes. "When I heard Beatrice mocking you at the ball, something inside me broke. I couldn't wait another day. I couldn't watch you fade away while I hid behind my guilt. My proposal, it was not a command. It was a desperate, clumsy, last-ditch plea. I was offering you a prison of gold because it was all I thought I had to offer. A name, security, protection. I never dared to hope you could see it as anything else. I never dared to hope for your affection." The confession hung in the warm, fragrant air between them. A secret kept for 10 years, a love born of a single moment and nurtured in the shadows of guilt and atonement. He had not been cold. He had been in mourning. He had not been ruthless. He had been driven. Everything she had thought she knew about him, about herself, was wrong. Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes, but they were not tears of anger or betrayal. They were tears of a profound, heartbreaking understanding. She thought of the lonely years, the quiet humiliations, the slow extinguishing of her hope. And she thought of him, alone in his own prison, working tirelessly to mend a world he had broken, all while loving a woman he believed he could never have. She rose from the bench and walked toward him. He watched her approach, his body tense, bracing himself for her judgment, for the hatred he had feared for a decade. She stopped in front of him and gently reached up, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. He flinched at her touch, as if expecting a blow. "Julian," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We have both been living in prisons of our own making." He closed his eyes, a single tear escaping to trace a path through the dust of his composure. The Iron Duke was finally, completely undone. "You do not hate me?" he asked, his voice choked. "Hate you?" she replied, a sad, gentle smile touching her lips. "How can I hate the man who remembered a flower I wore 10 years ago? How can I hate the man who gave me a library and defended my honor when I had none left?" She shook her head. "You have carried this burden alone for so long. You do not have to anymore." His control shattered. He pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair. His body shook with the force of a decade of restrained grief and love. He held her not with the possessiveness of a duke, but with the desperation of a drowning man clinging to a lifeline. Eleanor held him back, her arms wrapping around his broad back, offering a comfort she never thought she would have the chance to give. They stood like that for a long time, two solitary souls finally finding a shared harbour in the warmth of the secret conservatory. When he finally pulled back, his eyes were red-rimmed but clear. The crushing weight of his secret was gone, replaced by a fragile, tentative hope. He looked down at her, at the woman he had loved from afar for a quarter of his life. "Eleanor," he breathed her name like a prayer. He lowered his head, slowly this time, giving her every chance to turn away. She did not. She tilted her face up to meet his. His kiss was not the cold brush on the cheek from their wedding day. It was hesitant at first, a question. Then, as she responded, it deepened into something else entirely. It was a kiss filled with 10 years of unspoken words, of longing and regret, of penance and forgiveness. It was gentle and profound, a promise of a new beginning, a final closing of the book on their lonely pasts. In the warmth of the conservatory, surrounded by the life he had cultivated for her, Eleanor Vance, the spinster, the Duchess, finally felt her own hope begin to bloom. 2 years later, the Duke of Alistair's London mansion was unrecognizable. The silence was gone, replaced by the sound of laughter that echoed in the grand hallways. Sunlight streamed through windows that had long been shrouded, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air like tiny, joyful sprites. The east and west wings were no longer separate territories. The doors between them were permanently open, and the house had become a home. Eleanor sat on the same iron bench in the conservatory, a book lying open but forgotten in her lap. The air was still warm and fragrant, but now it was a familiar comfort, the scent of home. Julian entered, not with the purposeful stride of the Iron Duke, but with the easy, relaxed gait of a man at peace. He was not wearing a severe black coat, but a simple linen shirt, its sleeves rolled up to his forearms. The lines of tension around his eyes and mouth had vanished, replaced by a warmth that seemed to radiate from him. He smiled as he saw her, a genuine, unguarded smile that still made her heart leap. He came and sat beside her, taking her hand in his. His touch was no longer cool and possessive, but warm and familiar. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly. "I was thinking about how a person's worth is not defined by society," she replied, her gaze drifting over the vibrant camellias. "And how love can be patient, terribly, foolishly, wonderfully patient." He brought her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles with a reverence that never faded. "It was not foolish," he said. "It was the only thing that made sense in a world that had none." A small cry came from a bassinet, tucked in a warm, sunny corner of the conservatory. Julian rose and gently lifted their son, a beautiful baby with his mother's intelligent eyes and a dusting of his father's dark hair. He brought the child to Eleanor, and the three of them sat together, a small family forged from secrets and sorrow, now living in the light. The Iron Duke was a legend of the past, a story told in gentlemen's clubs. The Spinster of Berkeley Square was a forgotten whisper. Here, in this sanctuary of their own making, there was only Julian and Eleanor, a man and a woman who had found their way back to each other across a decade of silence, proving that it is never too late to begin again.
True love did not always announce itself with trumpets. Sometimes it waited quietly in the wings, tending a secret garden, waiting for the right moment to finally come home.